realized that we didn't do a land acknowledgement when the event started. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge and honor the Indigenous peoples who live and work on the land where you are, wherever you are. I'm right now speaking to you from Cape Cod, Massachusetts, which are the original homelands of the Mashpee, Wampanoag, Aquinnah, Wampanoag, Nipmuc, Massachusetts tribal nations. And we acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal from this territory, and we honor and respect the many diverse Indigenous peoples still connected to this land. And I hope wherever you are, you can reflect on the same territories and acknowledge the land that have been shepherded by the Indigenous peoples for thousands of years. We also stand with the Black Lives Matter movement and efforts to tear down structural racism. I think that's all part of and implicit in a lot of the conversations we've already been having today. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be here and to share some of the ideas that appeared in my article in the Rotman Management magazine. I think I'm going last because I can basically say what everyone else said. There were so many resonant themes across these different articles, and I'm looking forward to kind of seeing if I can make some connections between some of the ideas that Anita talked about in trade-offs, Marla's talked about with resilience, and Chris talked about with purpose, are going to come together in some of the arguments that I have been making. The title of my article is Build Back Better, very consistent with some of the ideas you heard, where you can't just try to get back to normal. As Anita said, the pandemic has exacerbated many social inequalities. These have always existed. It's just that we are, many of us who are in positions of privilege, seeing them much more clearly now and are able to hear the voices of the people who have been disadvantaged by many of the structures in our society. So the old normal wasn't so great. So let's not hope to get back to normal. Let's hope to build something new next, whatever language you want to use. Okay, so I want to just say that my ideas are that I'm going to be talking about have as their foundation ideas that I developed in the course of teaching a course called the 360 Corporation over the last 10 years, and then writing a book called the 360 Corporation from Stakeholder Trade-offs to Transformation, that really is thinking about how companies can better integrate the needs of all society and not just shareholders. This is a conversation that's going on more broadly in society, not just, of course, from me, but you've obviously heard from the other talks today. The first and kind of core idea is that business operations always create trade-offs, one way or another. And that we can't ignore them. If you think about, say, many of the examples of trade-offs that Anita gave in her talk, or you could think about Amazon same-day delivery. That's great for a consumer. I get products right away or the next day. It's great for Amazon. We've seen their revenues go through the roof, especially during this pandemic, but it also creates precarious delivery jobs. It increases congestion in cities. It increases pollution. Those are all trade-offs. And they're not always trade-offs that companies take into account when they're doing their business. And what this book did was try to give companies ways to think about, analyze, and understand that every business model has trade-offs, and then to develop some ideas to rethink them, not just getting stuck in the business case and only doing things that kind of meet financial goals. Innovate around those trade-offs, treating social responsibility as an opportunity for innovation and thriving within those trade-offs, even when you sometimes can't resolve them. And so the ideas that ended up coming out in my article have as their foundation, this teaching that I've been doing at the Rotman School for so many years. And so when the pandemic hit, it was a moment when we had the opportunity to go and see if all these companies that are now talking about purpose were going to make good on their promises. Were they really going to live up to the ideas that they had around social responsibility? And certainly most people are skeptical. Even before the pandemic, there were a lot of skepticism about whether companies really meant, whether it was just greenwashing or pinkwashing or whatever. There's no real data in Canada yet, but a survey in the United States before the pandemic actually showed that 1/3 of Americans thought technology companies and banks had a negative effect on the country, and more than half had a negative view of large corporations overall. And so we can assume that some of those beliefs might carry over into Canada. So there's a skepticism about the role of corporations in society, and therefore increasing pressure on corporations to do better. And that's in part because there has been a project over the last few decades to kind of undermine the power of the government to actually do the things that would represent what the, the citizens who elected them in a democratic process would have wanted. And so we have a dynamic going on in society right now where people are looking more to corporations for answers. And we know that during the pandemic, and very similar to data that Chris also mentioned in other analysis by Just Capital, suggests that companies that actually did pay attention to their employees and to the needs of their customers, for example, with loan forgiveness and things like that, actually are doing better than companies that were not thinking about those sets of stakeholders. And academic research and finance has also suggested that investing in corporate social responsibility leads to greater, what academics call social capital, meaning greater trustworthiness, and that trustworthiness leads to greater resilience because, of course, being trustworthy is something that's very valuable in times of uncertainty. So these are the questions that we're raising at this time, and then thinking about, okay, what does it mean to build back better? So in my article in the magazine, I proposed 3 ideas. You're getting a lot of lists in these talks, so you can, take these ideas for what they're worth. But I proposed 3 ideas for what it might mean to build back better. The first is to redesign work. The second is to reorient priorities. And the third is to reconfigure corporate governance. So I wanted to just tell you a little bit about each of those ideas. And again, building off of many of the conversations that we've already had over the course of these presentations, we know essential workers, we're constantly applauding them for all of the work they do, whether it's in the grocery store, in the hospitals, or things like that. But most of these people have been notoriously poorly paid, and they don't have great benefits. And so when we're talking about applauding essential workers, what we really need to do is think about, can we actually create livable wages, good benefits, and things like that, that make that recognize those jobs as essential by actually rewarding them as if they are essential. Should we want to go back to an old normal where those jobs weren't valued? I really don't think so. So we're talking about guaranteed sick leave and care leave, increased safety, a living wage. These are the kinds of things that would mean that we're really dealing with the deep inequalities that have produced these precarious jobs to begin with. And a lot of those things were resisted by companies before. Oh, we can't afford to pay more. But then in the pandemic, there was hazard pay and things like that going to, for example, grocery store workers. Now that's been rescinded as we're starting to reopen, but we know it's possible to actually do it. And as Anita said, we've now seen too many experiments during this pandemic to believe that a lot of these organizational changes are not possible. They actually are. And so now the previously unthinkable was accomplished, it seems hard to go back to old ways. The pandemic has also forced us in a whole bunch of new ways of working. So like us on this seminar, instead of being in a big room at the Rotman School, we're all speaking from our homes or our offices, but alone together. This kind of work has been something that disability advocates have asked for years. They have wanted accommodations for remote working and other kinds of technologies that would make their participation at work more feasible. And it was always said, oh, it's too expensive, we can't accommodate it, we don't know how to do it. And then suddenly, when all of us need to be able to do it, then these accommodations were made. And so why would we want to go back to a world that wasn't as inclusive for people with disabilities? And this is just one example of kind of universal design of work that I think could really change how we work and being more inclusive. And finally, I want to say, in terms of changing how we work, we need to focus on childcare. Childcare, I almost should have started it with it because it's the essential aspect of being able to make sure that people do have access to work. Right now, we are facing a situation where we could be losing a generation of women out of the workforce, because with daycares closed and schools closed, or going from home, or you never know if your school is going to close and your kids are going to have to come back home, someone has to be at home. And in our gendered society, most often that is the woman, and often, or in single family, single head of households, that's often the woman is the single head of the household. So we are talking about women who don't have the resources they need to be able to participate in work. And in fact, one of the reasons that a lot of daycare centers in Canada have not reopened is because the workers in the daycare centers don't actually have somewhere for their kids to actually be taken care of. For example, if the kids are still in doing school from home. So without figuring out how to care for our children, we are never going to make sure that women actually have access to equal opportunities in the workplace, and corporations are going to need to step up to that. Okay, so that's the first one, redesigning work. I think we've run a lot of experiments already with COVID, and we need to just keep running those experiments and then implementing them in a more permanent way. The second one is around reorienting priorities. And again, we heard a lot about this already today, this growing conversation about corporate purpose. In fact, in August 2019, which now feels like 100 years ago, but just before the pandemic, in the United States, the Business Roundtable issued a statement signed by 181 CEOs, basically saying that they were repudiating shareholder primacy, and they were going to focus on the importance of all stakeholders, claiming that they were going to actually create value for all stakeholders and consider them. Now, in doing so, this is a big turnaround from previous statements and from Milton Friedman's famous dictate that the sole purpose of the corporation is to basically provide for the shareholder. But the question is it real? Has it really come into fruition? If these companies say it, what does it mean for them to actually do it? And here's where we talk about the reorientation of priorities. And we could go back to the list that Anita shared of the Sustainable Development Goals that come from the UN. These can be easily transposed into goals that corporations could hold. And I actually think that there's a surfeit of reasons for this urgency, not just COVID, but climate change and employees, the famous millennials who no longer want to work for companies that don't actually destroy the environment or things like that. Employees crafting virtual social media posts. There's a million different reasons why companies should be really paying attention to this. I think it's tremendously important to reorient priorities and make those real. It's not enough to say you're going to have purpose. You have to actually do it, invest in it, and deal with the trade-offs that creates. And then the third recommendation is around reconfiguring governance. And I'm actually working on another project right now. If I wrote a book called The 360 Corporation, which was really about what management leaders, CEOs should be doing, my new project is around the 360 governance, which is what the board should do, what the boards of directors should be thinking about and doing in terms of changing how they exert their responsibility as trustees of corporations. And so this is going to mean creating mechanisms for stakeholders to have a voice, and that there are all sorts of processes that boards could put in place for that. But it might also include them instituting some kind of sustainability or social accounting, much like they do financial accounting, to also do sustainability and social accounting. There's a few competing standards out there for what that would look like. One is called SASB, to go with the financial accounting, which is FASB, sustainability accounting standards. But actually forcing the company to do accounting on their social responsibility, and just as there is an audit committee for the financials in a company, there should be an audit committee for the accountability for the social impact. And so I think there's a lot that boards of directors could do to reinforce the responsibilities here. It also means rethinking compensation. So the boards of directors have a compensation committee that is meant to make sure that the compensation of the leaders of the company is aligned with the purpose of the corporation. But if we are going to write the purpose of the corporation much more broadly, as companies are saying that they want to do, then we need to align compensation specifically around those goals. And then finally, there may be some other corporate models than our standard corporate model that might be useful. We know cooperatives are already a structure that allows for taking into consideration a wide variety of stakeholders, much as what's known as the benefit corporation, or B Corporation, is another model that's starting to gain traction in the Canadian context. And so I think we need to really, if we're going to build back better, we need to rethink corporate governance, and not just what happens inside the corporation, but how governance is exerted by the boards of directors, who we could think of as I said before, the trustees of the corporation. So just to recap, and I'll share my slide again, the three major themes that I'm talking about in this article are around redesigning, reorienting, and reconfiguring around work, priorities, and corporate governance. These are the things that I think are really going to make a difference if we want to build back better. I wanted to just, in the last minute or two that I have, to highlight one other aspect of building back better. So most of what I've been talking about so far has been about the business world and corporations, but business world and corporation operate in a context, which is the policy context. And so one of the things that I've also been spending time on over the course of this summer is a plan that with the Institute for Gender in the Economy that I run, GATE, joined with YWCA Canada to develop a feminist economic recovery plan for Canada, where a lot of these same themes come in, but can be applied at the different levels of government. So we're thinking of both the federal, provincial, and also city and other governments to think about how we can recover better, and how policy can, and government action can create a different context within which companies can also be operating. Of course, it starts with reconciliation and addressing systemic racism, because a lot of the fractures that the pandemic uncovered have to do with these issues. And we cannot do a recovery that works for everyone if we don't start with understanding those fundamental issues. And then, as I said before, care work is really at the core. That is, we need to rethink how we value care work in our society. And that means that corporates have to do that, but also the governments have to do that in terms of how they're funding and supporting care work, not only to make care work affordable for people who want to send their children or their elders to be cared for, but also for the workers who do the work in those care facilities, so that they can be paid well enough, that they can protect their own health, that they can have sick leave when they need to take sick leave. This is a whole complex of benefits. And what we know from research is that if for every $100 that you invest in care work relative to $100 invested in construction, the return to society is 2 to 3 times greater in terms of benefits to returns to the government resources, in terms of job creation, and in terms of economic inclusion for everyone. So we know that care work is really central. And then there's a number of other aspects that, again, I think dovetail onto some of the suggestions that have been made by my colleagues today around good jobs, fighting the shadow pandemic of gender-based violence, bolstering small businesses, many of which are run by women and people of color or in members of marginalized communities, strengthening our infrastructure for recovery. A thing that I really want to emphasize here is that if we all want to work from home or go to school from home, everyone needs internet access and high-speed internet access. That is not, it's almost a human right at this point, and that's something that not every person in Canada has access to. And I think there's a lot that the government can do, but also a lot that corporates can do to actually assure that. Part of building back better is making sure that everyone has access to these resources, and that we have diverse voices in decisions. So those were the major themes that I wanted to share with you. I wrote another piece recently that came out in the Hill Times in Ottawa called "Are We Letting This Crisis Go to Waste?" And what I want to encourage all of you to think about is, just as Anita and others were talking about, this crisis has enabled us to do things we never thought were possible, change behaviors we never thought were possible. At the Rotman School, we've been debating for years about teaching online. And just then on March 13th, we decided we would do it. And on March 16th, we were teaching all of our classes online. So we know that we can turn on a dime when we need to. We know we can make major transformations when we need to. Let's not let this crisis go to waste. The only silver lining in the terrible tragedy that is the pandemic, in terms of economic loss and of course loss of life and ill health, is that we use this opportunity to really change the direction of our society, change the direction of our economy. And so I think all 4 pieces that we talked about today really help us think about what are the parameters around which we might do that. And so I'm really grateful to have been able to share some of these ideas with you, and thank you all for joining.